we're going to be covering the inspection and testing contingencies today and going through that in detail. All right, the form is just being a little slow right now, so I'm just going to pull up this document here. All right, so we'll just get started here. So the inspection contingency is kind of the biggest contingency within the offer to purchase, whether it's a residential offer or a condo. They're both, whether you're writing on residential or a condo, they're pretty much written the same. So you can use this training for both types of transactions. The first thing to note is just acknowledging the difference between an inspection contingency and the testing contingency. So the inspection contingency is in the offer to purchase, specifically on page 4, and the contingency is an inspection, which is defined as, lines 179, an observation of the property, which does not include an appraisal or testing of the property, other than testing for leaking carbon monoxide or testing for leaking LP gas or natural gas used as a fuel source. So those are the only kind of tests that an inspector can do with regards to an inspection contingency. A test is defined as taking samples of materials such as soils, water, air, or building materials from the property for laboratory or other analysis of these materials. So that there is just acknowledging that there's a difference between the two. Most buyers will for sure want to have an inspection contingency. The testing contingency is separate from that, which is in GMAR Addendum A, there is a testing contingency. So if buyer wishes to be able to test for mold or test the water or do an air quality test, they need to have a separate testing contingency, or they're not obligated to test. So just want to preface that. Then it goes on to say here that the seller agrees to allow buyers, inspectors, testers, and appraisers reasonable access to the property upon advance notice to satisfy the contingencies in this offer. Buyer or licensees or both may be present at all inspections and testing. So with regards to this, I mean, I would for sure say the buyer should be there. That's the opportunity for the buyer to learn about the property, to understand, the different components of the property. There's a lot of great home inspectors out there who will kind of teach the buyer, like, this is how you take care of your property. These are, just common maintenance items that you'll want to get addressed every year. So definitely encourage your buyer to attend. We usually encourage the agents to attend as well. There are some other firms that say, nope, that's a liability. We don't want the agents going to the inspection. But in my experience, and Maureen, owner of KW, we see that there's more value in the agent going to the inspection so that you can hear firsthand what the issues are, if there are any issues with the property. So definitely recommend you going to the inspection with your buyer. Inspections usually last, depending on the size of the home, anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. So you hopefully are able to kind of take that time to be there for the whole inspection. If you aren't, you just have to communicate that to the listing agent to ensure you have confirmation to share the lockbox code with the inspector. Typically the inspector will start outside and then, spend half hour to an hour outside the property before they go in the property. But yeah, just an acknowledgement of how long they usually take. So they can take a couple hours. Sorry, I'm letting people in here as we go. So, and again, it reiterates again in line 184 to 185, except as otherwise provided, seller's authorization for inspections does not authorize buyer to conduct testing of the property. So, that includes a radon test. The buyer must have a radon testing contingency to be able to test for radon. The inspection contingency does not cover that. So just be sure that's communicated properly to the buyer. And then there's a note, any contingency authorizing testing should specify the areas of the property to be tested, the purpose of the test, any limitations on buyer's testing, and any other material terms of the contingency. So within a testing contingency, you have to state what the buyer is able to test for. So like I said, common ones are mold, maybe asbestos, maybe air quality. If the buyer has, health issues that they want to be sure the air quality in the home is sufficient for them. So those are conversations that you need to have with the buyer prior to writing the offer to understand what's important to them and whether they need a testing contingency or not. Goes on to state the buyer agrees to promptly restore the property to its original condition after the buyer's inspections and testing are completed, unless otherwise agreed to with the seller. Buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of all inspection and testing reports to the seller. So I get this question a lot. When do I have to deliver the inspection report? So to reiterate here, it says promptly. So typically that would mean, upon you receiving that from the inspector, that you're delivering it to the listing agent. Some agents handle it a little bit differently. I mean, if your buyer is kind of prepared to send over to the seller an amendment proposing some repairs, they might just attach it in that amendment and deliver it at that time. But for most buyers, sometimes it takes a couple days for them to determine, okay, what's really most important to me that I want to be sure the seller takes care of. So giving the seller a copy of the inspection report ahead of time is what you should be doing. All right, so moving into the contingency itself. So it again acknowledges this contingency only authorizes inspections, not testing. This offer is contingent upon a Wisconsin registered or Wisconsin licensed home inspector performing a home inspection of the property that discloses no defects. So first and foremost, they have to be a Wisconsin registered home inspector. Buyer cannot just have their contractor come through or their uncle who's a handyman. They have to be, like I said, a Wisconsin registered home inspector. If you search our Facebook page, people have, asked those questions. Hey, who do you recommend for a home inspector? Plenty of people have responded with their preference for home inspectors. I would typically provide a list of 3 different home inspectors that I recommend and allow the buyer to make the choice. They are the people responsible for contacting the inspector, hiring them to come out, and paying for the inspection. So, it's nice to be able to provide great customer service and do things for the buyer, but I think the home inspection is one of those that you want to encourage the buyer to take it upon themselves to hire the inspector and choose the inspector, because ultimately they're going to be the ones making, relying on the inspector's information and then making the decision of how they want to move forward through the transaction after the inspection is complete. So I also want to reiterate this line 195 here. It says that discloses no defects. So the contingency itself is based on buyer finding defects. If there are no defects, then theoretically the transaction just kind of would move forward and buyer would waive the contingency. Of course, a buyer can ask for anything at any time by proposing an amendment to the seller. But what you want to focus your buyer's attention on we're looking for defects here. And defects is defined later on in the offer to state that, something that would have a significant impact on the health, the safety, the structure of the property, something that would have a significant affect the value of the property. So setting up your buyer's expectations ahead of time it's really important to ensure, you move through this contingency smoothly. This is where deals fall apart is at the inspection. You know, it's buyer's second opportunity to come into the property, see the house again. A lot of times buyers may get cold feet or they just may get nervous about things that they're seeing in the house. And so you need to remind your buyers that we're looking for defects here. We're not going to be nitpicking little things. Oh, the carpet's peeling up here. Oh, there's a stain on the floor in this room. So focusing on those defects, something that would have a significant impact on the safety, the structure, the value of the property. The second piece of the inspection contingency. So the first piece, again, is that the inspector performs an inspection of the property. So property being defined as, 205 East Silver Spring Drive, the building, the structure, the entire property. The second component of it is that the offer is further contingent upon a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party performing an inspection of blank. And here's where a buyer could choose, okay, I want the home inspector is going to do their general home inspection of the entire home, but I want a specialist to come and look at the roof or the chimney or the foundation, or maybe there's a pool and we want the pool inspected further by a pool specialist. The furnace, maybe I want a specific HVAC person to come into and inspect the furnace. So here's where you would list any property components to be separately inspected. The third part of the inspection contingency states that the buyer may have follow-up inspections recommended in a written report resulting from an authorized inspection. So sometimes this second piece isn't really necessary to complete. If the buyer's like, I'm comfortable with just the home inspector doing a general inspection. I'm not, focused on any specific components. And then knowing that they are able to call in those specialists if need be. If the home inspector says, you know what, this chimney looks a little questionable or this roof looks a little bit questionable, I would recommend you have that further evaluated by a specialist. So if a buyer is not like, I'm not really concerned about any specific component, then you would just leave line 197 blank. And then you're relying on lines 200 to 202 to allow the buyer to have specialists come in if need be. And again, it just states that inspections shall be performed by a qualified independent inspector or independent qualified third party. So this would involve, like, if the foundation needs to be inspected further, that you're calling in a foundation specialist, like a foundation company, and same thing with a roofing company, et cetera. So they don't have to be necessarily an inspector, but a qualified third party. Line 203 states that the buyer shall order the inspection and be responsible for all costs of the inspection. Lines 204 to 205 acknowledge just that the buyer should provide sufficient time for the home inspection. So typically 14 days is common. I would say 10 to 14 is the most common. So with that is one of the first things that the buyer should be doing after they get an accepted offer, is scheduling that home inspection, because sometimes the inspectors can't get out there, until the following week. And now you've already eaten up 7 days of your 14-day inspection period. This deadline too includes the time that the buyer might need any follow-up inspections. So in the event the inspector says, the foundation looks questionable, I recommend you have a foundation specialist come out. All that must happen within that 14 days, as well as the buyer's opportunity to negotiate with the seller on items that they may want fixed. So the inspection, any follow-up inspections, and if necessary, an amendment regarding repair items must be executed within this time frame. So this deadline is so important. You cannot let this deadline pass without having an amendment executed if there are items that the buyer wants fixed, or issuing a notice of defects. And we'll get into that in a minute. I just want to stop and just see, does anybody have any questions before I continue? Oh, good. All right.
I'll jump in. Sorry. Given how busy everybody seems to be, is 14 days reasonable these days? Like, what is the soonest you could get an inspector to show up these days?
I would say 14 days is like, you're fine with 14 days, and that's playing it safe. I just personally went through this. My preferred inspector wasn't able to get in until I think I had a 12-day contingency. He wasn't able to get in until the 7th day. And that fortunately, we only had to have like one follow-up inspection, and they were able to come out the next day. So we were fine. We were well within the 14 day or the 12 days, but.
And do they work 7 days a week or just 5?
Some inspectors will do inspections on Saturdays. But I'm sure some don't. So it just depends on the inspector.
Okay.
So I would say 14 days, like I've never seen an inspection contingency. You have to say more than 14 days. And if you're saying that in the offer, that honestly might be a, not be a good selling point to the seller. Keep in mind, this deadline can always be amended. So if you say 10 days, buyer's offer gets accepted, you're calling inspectors and nobody's available for a week, you might want to just say to the listing agent, hey, we're having a really hard time getting an inspector to come out in the next couple days. Let's send over an amendment to extend this deadline so that we're not, at the 11th hour trying to figure out how a buyer and seller are going to move forward. So you can always amend this deadline if need be. And I would highly encourage you to do that if, let's say, so first thing with deadlines, once you get an accepted offer, put those deadlines in your calendar so that you do not miss them. And then let's say you're getting within 1 to 2 days of the inspection contingency deadline, and your buyer, there's still like a list of items that your buyer is trying to get follow-up inspections on, or buyer and seller are just not coming together on an agreement of how these repairs are going to be taken care of. Address the deadline extension before you get to that last day, because the last thing you want is to be on day 14 and then you're scrambling to get buyer and seller to sign an amendment to extend that contingency. So give yourself that time. Any other questions before I move on? Okay, so I'm going to bring up a flow chart that we've referenced before, and I can email this out to everybody. So this is like the home inspection contingency flow chart. Make this a little bit bigger. So you can see in the middle, we have the home inspection contingency, and then whether we give the seller right to cure or we don't give seller right to cure. So, and this just kind of takes us through what happens if. So you can see both, whether the seller has the right to cure or not. We're looking, are there defects or no defects? Defects or no defects? If there are defects, so you can see here and here, whether the seller has the right to cure or not, your first step should always be here, attempt to amend, meaning the buyer is not forced to deliver a notice of defects. The first, I'm going to go back to my offer here. The first step, so buyer does their home inspection, and inspector comes back and says, here's a summary of the issues that we found. Are they defects? That's the first question. Are they defects? Are they significant enough that the buyer wants items repaired? Most of the time, a seller is willing to negotiate and willing to repair some items if they come up in an inspection. So the first thing a buyer should do is attempt to negotiate by drafting up an amendment to the offer to purchase, a WB-40 amendment. The buyer would say, see if I can quickly pull one up here. A buyer would say, here's basically a list of items that I want the seller to fix. And we do have some really great language in our clause library that you can quickly insert into the amendment. SIP forms is running a little bit slow today. So the language states, seller at seller's expense shall complete the following repairs, provide lien waivers, invoices as applicable, and provide to buyers no later than 10 days prior to closing. So by including that language, one, you're acknowledging that the seller is going to be paying for it. And by when must they complete these repairs? You want to give them a deadline, and you don't want to give them until the day before closing to fix everything. You want to, I would say, at least 5 to 10 days before closing, have the seller fix the items. And then you go in and list the items that the buyer would like the seller to repair. So whether it's addressing roof concerns or foundation concerns, or maybe the seller needs to call in an HVAC company to further evaluate the furnace and repair as recommended. There's a lot of different ways to draft an amendment for repairs, but the intent, or just in general, you want to be clear about what the buyer wants completed. Now with an amendment, all right, we're having a hard time bringing that up, so I'm just going to pop over here. With the amendment, a buyer can basically dictate exactly what a seller is supposed to do. They can say the seller needs to hire AD roofing company to come out and do these repairs, or they need to hire, they can be specific about who they hire and how the work is done. So that's the reason why an amendment is the most preferred way to kind of work through the inspection contingency. So again, going back to that flow chart, if there are defects found, whether the seller has the right to cure or not, the first attempt or the first step is to attempt to amend the offer to purchase. If the seller has the right to cure and buyer and seller are able to agree on an amendment, we go to close. Same thing with if they don't have the right to cure. If they're able to agree on amendment, yes, we go to closing, or we move forward to the next, to the next contingency. So it doesn't matter whether the seller has the right to cure or not. As long as buyer and seller are able to come to an agreement on that amendment, we move forward and the buyer, continues with their purchase. Where the right to cure comes into play is if the buyer has to deliver a notice of defects. And the buyer would deliver a notice of defects if they go through the inspection and there are significant defects, and the buyer is like, you know what, I really don't want to move forward anymore. I don't even want to attempt to negotiate with the seller. I'm going to deliver a notice of defects. So it's kind of complicated because it's not always that's not always the decision the buyer can make on or it's not always their own, how do I want to say this? It's not necessarily just their decision to terminate the transaction. So this is where it really becomes important that you explained to the buyer what it means to give the seller the right to cure. If a buyer gives the seller the right to cure, and there are defects found, and they give a notice of defects, there's 3 things that could happen. Again, we can still attempt to amend the offer to purchase. The seller can elect to cure the defects, which means they're saying, yep, I'm going to cure these defects. We're moving forward. So by giving the seller the right to cure, it gives the seller the opportunity to say, yes, we're going to move forward with this transaction, or no, we're going to terminate the transaction. Seller elects not to cure the offer and the offer is null and void. So if your buyer, I'm going to jump back over here to right to cure. So we're on line 216. If the buyer wants to have the final say as to whether or not the transaction stays together after discovering there are defects in the property, then this should be read as seller shall not have the right to cure defects. So you should be striking shall so that it reads seller shall not have the right to cure defects. If the seller does not have the right to cure, then the buyer has the final say as to whether this deal stays together or not in the event defects are found after an inspection. If a buyer is saying, you know what, I love this property so much, if there's major defects found, I'm going to give seller the opportunity to cure those defects, even if we can't come to an agreement on how they're cured. So first step, again, is always to try to amend the offer to purchase so that the buyer can kind of dictate how they're cured. But if the seller isn't agreeing with, I don't want to hire AD Roofing Company, I want to hire my own company, and the buyer's okay with that, then giving the seller the right to cure shouldn't be an issue. So let's kind of dive into the offer to purchase and how it plays out, and then we'll kind of jump back to the flow chart because that can sometimes look a little confusing. So I just first want to note that lines 212 to 215 does reference the definition of a defect again. So another opportunity for you to review that as well as reference that for your buyer. Sorry, let me jump up a little bit more here. I missed lines 210 and 211. So it says, for the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions to the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge or written notice of before signing this offer. So this would mean if the seller disclosed on their real estate condition report significant defects, the buyer cannot claim those as defects. They can't now say, oh, wait, I want you to fix these things. The seller has already disclosed those, so they can't claim them as defects. So now with the right to cure. Let's go through an example if you give the seller the right to cure. So if we say seller shall have the right to cure the defects, if the seller has the right to cure and buyer delivered a notice of defects. Now again, I just want to restate this because I feel like I've been jumping around a little bit, but this right to cure section is never triggered unless the buyer delivers a notice of defects. So buyer and seller, we want the transaction to move forward, our first attempt is always to try to amend the offer to purchase by drafting a WB-40 amendment to the offer. Buyer acknowledges, hey, these are the repairs that I want addressed. Hopefully seller signs and we move forward. If the seller refuses, if they can't come to an agreement on that negotiation, then the buyer would need to deliver a notice of defects, or they're going to risk purchasing the property as is. So if the buyer is in a position where they need to deliver a notice of defects, then the right to cure language is triggered. So if the seller has the right to cure, they can deliver a notice back to the buyer within 10 days, which is default, after the buyer's delivery of the notice stating their election to cure the defects. So they would simply write back to the buyer, sellers elect to cure the defects. Then they must cure those defects in a good and workmanlike manner and deliver to the buyer a written report detailing the work that was done no later than 3 days prior to closing. So that's all that would happen if seller has the right to cure and buyer delivers a notice of defects. If the seller does not have the right to cure and buyer delivers a notice of defects, the offer is null and void, very simply. So that's why sometimes we're a buyer, And we've been seeing this a lot lately, where buyers, I think, are just getting cold feet, or for whatever reason after the inspection, whether there are defects or not, or I should say significant defects or not, buyers like, you know what, I really don't want to move forward anymore. The only clean way to get out of the transaction is to have not given the seller the right to cure, and then issue a notice of defects, and then the offer is automatically null and void. So down here, lines 222 to 226, this offer shall be null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of the notice of defects, meaning they delivered it before that deadline, along with the written inspection report, and the seller does not have the right to cure, or the seller has the right to cure, but they have elected not to cure, or they don't deliver a notice in time stating that they elect to cure. I just feel like I did a lot of rambling, and I know this can be confusing. So
can you say that? Can you say that one more time? The clean way that the buyer can get out of an offer.
Don't give seller right to cure.
Okay.
So you would strike shall, so that it reads seller shall not have the right to cure.
Okay.
That is the cleanest way a buyer would be able to, basically it leaves the decision to the buyer. So if the buyer wants to have the control as to whether or not the transaction stays together after doing the inspection, you would not want to give the seller the right to cure. Now, on the flip side to that, in a competing market, many buyers feel like I have to give the seller the right to cure, right? Because it's showing that by giving seller the right to cure, a buyer is essentially saying, even if there are defects found, as long as you're willing to cure the defects, I will move forward with this transaction. So you're kind of putting it in the seller's hands as to whether the transaction moves forward if there are significant defects. So it's, yeah, it's simple, but it's not. Any other specific questions that I can cover right now? I'll just kind of recap the biggest points I want to hit home with you guys. One is this deadline. You cannot let this deadline pass without, if this deadline passes and no action is taken, the buyer is buying the house as is. So whatever repairs need to be done, they're going to be there when the buyer closes. The seller is not obligated to agree to repair anything after this deadline passes. So that's first and foremost. And then the second one being just really educating your buyers on what it means to give the seller the right to cure. I would say most, like 90% of the time, buyer and seller are able to come to an agreement by executing an amendment and moving forward. The issue with having items repaired by the buyer delivering a notice of defects is it states in the offer is that the seller would cure the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. So that kind of takes away the buyer's knowledge of, well, who's doing the work, how is the work being done, how is this defect being cured? The buyer's really not going to know until 3 days prior to closing who did the work and how the work was done. Because the other thing with an amendment, let's see if I can try opening that up again. Nope. A buyer can be specific about, again, who is doing the work, meaning a licensed plumber, a licensed electrician, licensed contractor, but the seller isn't, what does good and workmanlike manner mean? I think that's kind of very general. And so when buyers are in this position where they're like, ooh, I want to move forward, but I'm not comfortable with the seller curing in a good and workmanlike manner, I want to be able to have more of a say of how these repairs are fixed. ideally then you don't want to deliver notice of defects. You want to come to an agreement with an amendment. So that is the gist of the inspection contingency. I'm going to jump over to Addendum A. So Addendum A addresses the the testing contingency. So again, same thing, lines 19 through 27, kind of acknowledge again the difference between a test and an inspection. And then it goes on to have, there's a general testing contingency, and then there's well water testing, septic inspection contingency, which is down here, the private sanitary system. For most, if you are renting on a property that does have a well or a septic, you definitely want to include those contingencies as separate from the general testing contingency. So the testing contingency reads that its offer is contingent upon the buyer obtaining a current written report from a qualified independent third party documenting the results of the following tests conducted pursuant to applicable government or industry protocols and standards. So you do need to list specific tests like mold, asbestos. What I like to do is I like to list the tests and then also say only if recommended by home inspector. So I'm including this contingency, but I'm not just going to go test for mold or test for asbestos. I'm just going to only test if it's been recommended to me by my home inspector. So you're saying to the seller, you know, I'm not just assuming there's mold. I'm just putting this in here in the event my inspector recommends it. Because even if the inspector recommends mold testing or asbestos testing or whatever kind of testing, buyer can't do the test if they don't have the testing contingency. With the testing contingency, you do acknowledge who's paying for it. Is this buyer's or seller's expense? So most cases it's going to be the buyer's expense, and that whether the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure. So I would just kind of mirror whatever you acknowledged for the inspection contingency. If you're giving the seller the right to cure for the inspection, I would give them the right to cure for the testing, and same with, or vice versa. Oops. And then, oops, I want to jump over here, sorry. As far as the right to cure goes for testing contingencies, on page 2 of GMAR Addendum A, line 67 to 78, goes through and kind of explains that whole right to cure. In the event a notice of defects is delivered, here's what happens next. So you'll want to be sure you read through that if you are in that situation where you have to deliver notice of defects based on tests. Any other questions that I can cover on this topic? Do you guys feel like you have a clear understanding? Do you want me to try to give another general overview? I know this can kind of throw people. It's a hard one to explain sometimes. Good. That's all I have to cover then for today. If there's no other questions. If it's helpful, if you'd like a copy of this flow chart, if you don't have one, type your email in the comments box and I'll be sure to email it to you. This can be kind of nice to use with clients to explain to them, hey, this is how the right to cure works or not. And I would say the biggest difference being with right to cure and giving a notice of defects, what happens. And same thing with no right to cure, giving a notice of defects, offers null and void. So that's where the biggest difference lies between those two choices. Perfect. I will email a copy of this to you guys. And then always don't hesitate to call me if you guys ever have questions, or if you're in a situation, transactional situation that you're not sure how to handle. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.